to know if verse 1 here in the Hebrew Bible is actually verse 2. In the English Bible, the last verse of chapter 12, which is verse 32, in the Hebrew Bible is actually the first verse in this particular chapter. And the reason for it is it kind of sets up and ties everything in, and really it ties the 12th chapter and the 13th chapter together. But today we're going to be talking about false prophets and some of the bad things that false prophets does, and what God's plan was to deal with false prophets. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer. I think what we're going to find here in chapter 13, there is a lot of things in this chapter that really apply to us today, because the same thing that Moses warns about in this chapter goes on today. So let's start out by looking at the first 5 verses. It says, "If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder came to pass, whereof he spoken to thee, saying, Let us go after other gods which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer, for the Lord your God proveth you to know whether ye love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Ye shall walk after the Lord your God, fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and ye shall serve him and cleave unto him. And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he hath spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to thrust thee out of the way which the Lord thy God commandeth thee to walk in. So thou shalt put the evil away from the midst of thee." So the primary thing here that we're talking about in this particular section of the 13th chapter is we're talking about a prophet. Now, a prophet is a proclaimer or a foreteller. And a prophet was then a kind of a spokesman for God who represented him before other people. Now, we read all the way through the Bible of prophets from God, and we also read about false prophets. So we see here kind of in the introduction that it also talks about a dreamer of dreams. So this, along with the prophet, kind of talks about the two medias that God uses to give divine revelation. A vision, which would be the prophet, or a dreamer of dreams. And this is kind of referred to a little bit and talked about in Numbers, the 12th chapter, verse 6, where how God reveals his will to man in that time. Numbers 12 and 6 says, "And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream." So these are the two authorized ways that God had to communicate with this type of person. Now, if we have a true prophet, on the other side we have a false prophet. And this is a prophet that tells, is lying to you. They look good, they sound good, but they're lying to you. It's kind of like a politician. The only way you can tell that they're lying to see if their mouth's moving. Kind of a deal like that. Yeah, lawyers too, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, the Tegrim of Jonathan talks about one that pretends to be a true prophet and to be sent from God, and comes to him with a message from God, but it's a new message. It's one that has not been revealed in the past, and it's contrary to the doctrine that God has already set forth. And we have talked hundreds of times about the consistency of God. God has a plan. God sticks to his plan. God doesn't deviate from his plan. And God always speaks the truth. He doesn't tell one person one thing one time and tell somebody else something different at the other. And this is one of the things we have to look at when we have somebody that talks about that they're a prophet. Is their prophecy consistent with the Word of God? Now, God here is going to permit some prophets to claim that they have direct revelation from God, or that they speak for God, or and they praise God all over the place. And they're going to arise in Israel, and they're going to perform miracles or signs or wonders. But what they're actually advocating is apostasy. They're not advocating things that God wants them to do. So seemingly, they're going to foretell the future, and it all looks good on paper, and it all looks good, and some of these things come forth. And they're even going to be able to perform some signs or some type of supernatural acts. Now, if you think about it, the back in Egypt, the soothsayers back in Egypt, they had the ability to do some magic tricks also. And you got to kind of separate magic tricks from miracles in situations like this. But God is going to permit these prophets to come to the children of Israel, and the reason he does that, he's testing them. And that's kind of what we're talking about here in verse 3. He's testing them to see if they're going to remain true to God. So this is kind of the acid test that we're going to use with prophets and people who are proclaiming the Word of God. Is in this case, it's what was their fidelity to the covenant that God had given Moses? Was the things that they were saying consistent with the things that God had revealed from Moses and the commandments that God had given through Moses? So, is he directing them to live according to the laws and the rules that he has given, not only from a spiritual standpoint, but also in their civil conduct also. A lot of these things we've talked about so far in this book is, some of it have been moral things that are owed to God, but also civil things, how you interact with your fellow man, and how that government basically is going to take place. So, what they need to be looking at, and what he warns them here is this prophet telling you to walk with God. If not, then there's going to be a problem, because these prophets' job is not to lead them to God, but it's to lead them away from God. So the warning here is, if you find a prophet like this, they need to be purged from among the people. They need to be need to be put to death. And this kind of reinforces the fact to the children of Israel that being enticed to adultery was a very serious crime. And if you were out there enticing the children to go away from God, then that was going to be a serious crime, and it was going to be purged. Well, when we talk about being purged, we're talking about putting that prophet to death, and we'll talk about that a little bit further as we go on. Now, this purging is so important that it's talked about at least 8 times in Deuteronomy, that these things that are bad need to be purged, because if you stay with them, they're going to get infiltrated into the fabric of the people's lives, and it's going to cause problems. So we see here first in this first section that we're talking about kind of an outside influence coming into to a family or to a person or something like that. Comments about those verses? All right, let's look then at verses 6 through 11. If thy brother, the son of thy mother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or thy wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, namely, of the gods of the people which are around about you, not nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. Thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him, neither shall thine eyes pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him. But thou shalt surely kill him, and thine hand shall be first upon him, to put him to death, and the afterwards at the hand of all the people. And thou shalt stone him with stones, that he die, because he has sought to thrust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And all Israel shall hear and fear, and shall do no more any such wickedness as this is among you. So the second case we hear and we talk about is the temptation to adultery that comes from somebody that's close to you, either one of your relatives, your blood relatives, or one of your close friends. And so we see here that it's not just the religious leaders who can suffer from this crime, but it's also the rank and file children of Israel who put themselves in a position to espouse something that's away from the will of God. Now, it's kind of interesting to note as we went through that list, the one person that was not mentioned was the father. It talks about the mother, the brother, the sons, and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't talk about the father. Now, some of the Jewish writers think that the father was not mentioned because of the reverence that was held in the family for the father. And with all these dealings, though, he's going to be obligated to kind of watch this. However, just because he is not mentioned as one of the ones here doesn't mean he's exempt from it. If he's doing these things, then he's going to be subject to the punishment that anybody else would. And it is more of a matter of respect and reverence that he wasn't mentioned in this particular group. But the reverence of God is to be preferred over the reverence to the parents and the reverence of the parents. Not that reverence to your parents is not important, but it's more important to be reverent to God. Because as we kind of work our way down through here and talk about these verses, you're going to see here that the punishment is very severe, and I think it's interesting to note what's not talked about here and what was actually practiced. I think is kind of interesting. So all of these relations in the family group are pretty much mentioned, but none are going to be spared if they're guilty of the sin of trying to introduce another god into the mix. So if the father's involved in this, then obviously he's going to be involved also. Now we see here that this person is going to come secretly. In other words, they're not out proclaiming this like a prophet does. They're going kind of inside and say, hey, come over here, let's talk about this. This is something that is done in secret. The transgressor and the person that they're trying to entice pretty much have a one-on-one type relationship, and it's done in secret. And that's kind of one of the keys here. So there's not going to be anybody there to try to persuade the one who is being enticed that this is wrong. If you want to convince somebody to do something wrong, you get them alone. And that way there's not somebody there that has a little bit better moral compass to say, you know what, you really shouldn't be doing that. They don't get that. They don't get that guidance. It's kind of like, you see the cartoon where you got the devil sitting on one shoulder and you got the angel sitting on the other shoulder, and both of them are putting advice into somebody's head. Well, what we got in this situation is we got the devil sitting here giving the advice, and there's nobody on the other side to counteract it. That's why we do this in secret. Now, we know that this has happened before because Satan took the opportunity of catching Eve alone and convincing her into transgressing against God and doing something that she shouldn't have done. Now, if Adam would have been there when this happened, it might not have happened. But, we see here that, you've got to have your moral compass together when you're alone with somebody that you might not trust. And, the moral compass is set up when you're a child, and you raise your child up and you get that moral compass set. And the people who get preyed on the most are the people that don't have that moral compass. And that's what Moses is talking about here. The one, could you imagine this trying to happen to somebody like Joshua? It ain't going to happen. He's going to run them right out of the house before it even starts. But, you have strong members and you have weak members, and the getting these weak members is what we're kind of talking about here. Now, obviously, the gods that they were talking about here is the gods of the Canaanites and the gods of some of the neighboring nations, which where the children of Israel has filtered into it. But primarily, we're talking about the gods of the Canaanites. So, to prevent this influence of sin, Moses goes into detail here and says, the gods that are close here, the gods that are next door, the gods that are far off, any god that is a false god, pretty much anywhere on the earth. And the warning is there that no matter where you go on the earth, there's going to be false gods. And you've got to be aware of this. You've got to be aware of this all the time. And you think about, even today, all the religions that are out there and all the false gods that are worshipped all over the world. There's a lot of them out there, and wherever that false god may be on the earth, these rules apply, and they apply to us today, just like they do to the children of Israel back then. So the children of Israel were not to yield to this temptation, and also they were not going to spare the tempter. And we see here that there's kind of an accumulation of synonyms, the pity, the spare, the conceal, have pity, be empathetic to these people. If they're doing this, there's not going to be any pity. I mean, when you calls for the death penalty, that's a pretty good indication that there's not to be any pity. And it's told here that they're to be stoned to death. And that was today that would probably be considered cruel and unusual punishment. We always make sure that, when somebody's put to death, that that's a very calm and easy death for them. We wouldn't want them to do to them what, they did to their victim or something like that. Stoning is not a calm and easy death. So the execution here is going to be carried out through the regular authorities. Okay, and this is talked about in other parts of the Decalogue or the first 5 books. This is talked about. This is not something that you say, hey, this guy did this, I'm gonna stone him to death. That's not the way it worked. That's not the way God's plan works. He has a process that has gone through, and basically it's kind of like we do here. The charge is made, the evidence is brought forth, the authority makes the judgment, and then the judicial process is prescribed in the 17th chapter, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And it's important here, and this is all the way through the writings of Moses, the importance of witnesses. Okay? If you go one-on-one with somebody, it's your word against them. But in this case, in Deuteronomy 17, verse 7, it says, the hands of the witnesses shall be first upon to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people, so thou shalt put the evil away from among you. So it talks here about witnesses. So because this was done privately and in secretly, that's one of the reasons they did this, so that there wouldn't be any witnesses to the things that were going on. But what was supposed to happen is that the one who was being enticed would go to the authorities, and they would make the accusation that this person was trying to get me to go along with the false prophet. So, according to the ancient writings, what they would do is they would do a little sting operation. They would get the person who was the enticer and the one who was being enticed, and they would get them back together. And then what they would do is they would have some witnesses that were hid, either in the house or in the bushes or wherever, so that they weren't seen, so that you would have that 2 to 3 witnesses. Now, the neat thing about this and the way that they did it is that they would, the one who was making the accusation would try to get the enticer to try to entice him again. The neat thing about it if he didn't entice again, he could not be held liable for that. And the theory was that he had thought it over and decided that wasn't the best thing to do. However, if he did try to entice that person again, the witnesses then would hear what was going on, and then now you fulfilled the law about having the 2 and 3 witnesses. So they would bring that person to the Sanhedrin, the court, and then they would make the determination and they would make the judgment. It was all done according to the way that God had prescribed that this be done, and it wasn't you took the thing upon yourself.
If you jump forward to verse 14, this isn't supposed to be a knee-jerk reaction.
Absolutely.
In verse 14, you shall inquire, you shall search out, you shall ask diligently. So they were supposed to do some very thorough investigation.
Absolutely. It's called due process, is what it's called. Okay? And we see here that once the judgment is made and once the sentence has been prescribed, the person who was the one being enticed is the one who gets to cast the first stone. And the witnesses to this are the ones that cast the first stone. So, that kind of adds a little bit to it, and that kind of adds some credibility to it, that these people believed in the charges that they were making. They were actually participating in the stoning. And then once they got the first stones cast, then the rest of the community was invited to come in and participate in the stoning. And this is something that went through not only in Old Testament times, but it went through in New Testament times too. Paul held the garments for the crowd who was stoning Stephen. So this was a common form of punishment there. And Kevin is absolutely right there. This was a serious situation because somebody was being executed. And if the charges were false, then they were murdering somebody that didn't deserve it. So all of this had to be done in a proper management. Now, Moses pretty much here sets forth a deterrent that had value among the children of Israel, which was actually, capital punishment. And, it was done that way so that the message was sent that, number one, this evil was not going to be tolerated. And number two, if you did this evil, your life was going to be taken from you. So, it was something that probably if the children of Israel saw somebody stoned to death, it would probably be installed in their mind. And, I've never seen anybody being executed, but, I always think kind of back to the John Wayne movie, McClintock. Or no, wait a minute. It was Chisholm. And the old English, the guy with the English accent was talking about that, he watched a hanging one time, and the only thing he could think about, it was ghastly. And, that there would probably be this, I think that would be the same situation that we would have. It would probably, turn some of our stomachs to sit and watch this happen. So, and you would probably never forget it. So it's something that would be indulged in or embedded in the mind of the children of Israel, so that they wouldn't want to be caught in a situation like this. Number one, they wouldn't want to do it, and number two, they wouldn't want to suffer the punishment if they did do it.
That's the end of the lesson. Is that what that would be?
Yeah, that would
One
be.
of those situations was getting rid of a problem in the camp.
Right. Yeah, I remember. I think it was Carl Cornell was teaching, and Carl Lucas was sitting back there in the back. And if y'all remember Carl, he was a state trooper. And I think Carl asked Carl, he said, Carl asked Carl, what did he thought of capital punishment? And Carl said, there's no repeat offenders. So we get a situation like this. So, one of the more modern commentators made the comment. It said, in modern times, advocates of the abolition of capital punishment have argued that this practice does not deter crime, but the scriptural testimony says that it does. So, I thought that was an interesting comment to make, because capital punishment is kind of a hot political topic at times. Comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verses 12 through 14. If thou shalt hear say in one of thy cities, which the Lord thy God has given thee to dwell there, saying, certain men, the children of Beel, are gone out among you, and have withdrawn the inhabitants of the city, saying, let us go and serve other gods which ye have not known. Then thou shalt inquire and make search, and ask diligently, and behold, if it be truth, the things certain, that such abomination is wrought among you. So here we see a third case where a town has been led away by adultery. So this word Baal, whatever, it's a Hebrew word that's used to characterize the wicked or worthlessness. And the idiom sons of Baal appears 15 times, which indicates the worthlessness of the people, including the adulterers here in verse 13. So the thought is not that they would hear in one city about another, where one city would have oversight over another, but that the people need to be aware that these things are going on, and that there's people in this city that these things can happen to, and the city as a whole, because or have been led astray by whoever. It could be the false prophet, it could be an internal type of thing, but they're being led astray. And in verses 15 through 16, we're going to see the consequences of that. It's one thing to put a person to death. It's a little bit different situation to put a whole city to death. So let's look at verses 15 and 16. Thou shalt surely smite the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, destroying it utterly, and all that is therein, and the cattle thereof with the edge of the sword. And thou shalt gather all the spoil of it into the midst of the street thereof, and thou shalt burn it with fire the city, and all the spoil thereof every whit, for the Lord thy God, and it shall be a heap forever, it shall not be built again. So basically, when there's a report that the people as a whole have taken this course through their rulers, basically, that this situation, this whole affair, is to be thoroughly examined. Just like With the individual, it's thoroughly examined through the court system. This situation is thoroughly examined also. And if it be found that these people are actually doing these things and the whole city is trying to move away to a false god, then action needs to be taken. And the action is that the city is to be smited. It's supposed to be invaded, and the people are supposed to be killed all the way down. Every animal is supposed to be utterly destroyed. All the possessions are going to be piled up in the middle of the town, and the whole town is going to be set on fire. And it's going to be a situation where there's going to be complete destruction. And nothing is going to be spared. The people, the animals, and all the material property, not just the men. And the clause here, destroying, that's the punishment. The punishment is the city is going to be destroyed. And the ban was to be executed in all of its severity upon the adulterous city. Man and beast were being put to death without reserve. And there's not going to be any spoil that's going to be brought out of this conquest. It's all supposed to be destroyed in that situation. And basically, the town would be, as one writer says, left as a heap of ruin, never to be built on again. So it was a situation where they're not going to rebuild it. Now, that was kind of an unusual situation in ancient time. When a town or a city would be destroyed, it was normally rebuilt. And even to this day, they are going through and they do excavations on some of these ancient cities, and they dig down layer after layer after layer, and they found town after town after town that's been rebuilt. But in this situation, the whole town is going to be completely and utterly destroyed. Some of the scholars, talk about the town of Gilby, which is in the city of Benjamin in Judges 20, actually 19, 20, and some into 21. And it wasn't exactly the same circumstances, but it was a situation where God destroyed the city be completely and utterly destroyed because of its gross sinfulness against the children of Israel. And we can read about this in Judges chapters 19 through 21. Now, according to Josephus, this town was located about 30 miles north of Jerusalem, which would roughly correspond with the location of Tel Aviv, which is the area that they talk about. And this area is there today. And what's interesting to note about this, and God said that this town was never to be rebuilt. And I was doing a little bit of reading, and I found this explanation here. Some of you may remember King Hussein of Jordan back several years ago. And he actually began construction of his royal palace at the site where Josephus said that this town was. But the construction was halted when the 6-day war broke out, and of course Israel won the war, and they occupy that part of the area. And this palace was never finished, and it was never occupied. And the only thing that remains is the skeleton of the building. So God said there was never supposed to be a city there. That applies today also. So I thought, and that may not be the site, but I thought that was kind of interesting, going back to some of the writings of Josephus. Other comments about that? Okay, let's see if we can finish this up. Let's look at verses 17 and 18. And there shall cleave not of the cursed things to thine hand, that the Lord may turn from the fierceness of his anger, and show thee mercy, and have compassion upon thee, and multiply thee as he hath sworn unto thy fathers, when thou hast hearkened to the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments, which I command thee to this day, do that which is right in the eyes of the Lord. So all of these potential crimes in ancient Israel, and the ones that we've talked about in this chapter, was the most dangerous pretty much in its broader ramifications, and that was to deliberately undermine the allegiance that they had to God. And we see here that this enrages God. He has pronounced terrible judgment on the people that do this, because the point of the whole thing is that he wants them to cling to him, to do the things that he wants them to do, and to have them, or to have him as the center of their life, and not some false god. And he is willing to he's willing to make sure this happens by either putting somebody to death, or by doing some type of invasion. And if you kind of think about it, in a worldly type of situation, this is kind of equivalent to treason. Having treason against God. People have treason against their nation. Well, this is treason against God, or doing some type of espionage in the time of war. It's a terrible crime. It's a terrible thing, and there's a lot of implications to it. So, there's a lot of the even today, a lot of these religions in the Middle East, even though they're false religions, they have strict penalties against going against their God, whether it be Allah or whichever God they want to worship. There are strict penalties about going against their God. So we need to be aware of the seriousness of following other gods, and we don't want them to get into our midst. Now, probably in this day and time, we would probably have a little bit of problem with taking somebody out and stoning them. I think that would probably be a little bit too far. But, the New Testament talks about church discipline and things that needs to be done. And one of the reasons for doing that is to keep, false gods from coming in. And we need to watch, and we need to make sure that we are separating ourselves from false teachers. And it goes back to how do we do that, is knowing what the Word of God says and test what they're saying versus what the Word of God says. Because, you think about it, you watch some of this stuff on TV, some of these guys that's supposed to have all this, the one that used to come to mind was Ernest Angley. I don't know if you remember him or not.
He's still around.
That old boy is something else.
He's in his 90s and he's still around.
And I can remember when I worked day shift at the fire department, he came on at 7:30 in the morning on Channel 13. That was back in the dark ages when we only had 3, 8, and 13. And when the show came on, he was on a pedestal in all white, and the lights would come on. Like he was some type of deity or something like that. And, he's not the only one. There's a lot of them out there. There's a lot of false prophets. And we need to not let them influence us, and we need to keep on the straight and narrow path. So I did get through the chapter, so you can start next week with chapter 14. So I appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.